Hey, Tommy, will you say the prayer tonight? Okay. All right, it's time for us to get started. It's good to be here with you. It's good to have you here as well. We're going to be finishing up the book of Zechariah tonight. Before we get started, Tommy's going to say a prayer for us.
Father, thank you for this time we have to be together as a family. Help us tonight to understand from the book of Zechariah what you want us to see. Help us to think spiritually about things. Help us to grow in that ability. Help us to see with the eyes that truly see and ears that truly hear. We pray that you can be with all those of our number who are needing your attention. Help us know what that might be. Give us the desire to be instrumental in your service. We pray in your Son's name.
Amen. Okay, we left off in chapter 13 last week, in which God is talking about his plans for the future in the days of the Messiah. We noticed in chapters 12, 13, and 14 that these are all apocalyptic in nature, and God is talking about what's coming down the road for purpose, is the fulfillment of his purpose and for his spiritual Israel. And we know that this is talking about the days of the Messiah for a couple of reasons. One, some of the prophecies that are given in Zechariah in chapters 12 and 13 specifically are in reference to Christ. We know that because they're quoted in the New Testament in reference to Christ. So when we read that repeated phrase throughout these chapters, in that day, in that day, in that day, in that day, those are all time markers indicating to us that these are things that are going to happen long in the future. These are going to happen down the road in the days of the Messiah. And if you're in chapter 13 and you look at that first verse, it says, in that day, a fountain shall be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and for uncleanness. And this, of course, is in reference to Christ and his cleansing ability through his sacrifice on the cross. We notice that from John chapter 7, where Jesus talks about he is the fountain. And then we talked about that in John chapter 4, verses 10 through 14, where Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman at the well when he offers to her. And we're going to see that theme repeated again in chapter 14. Now, we went through all the way down through chapter 13 and verse 7, where it talks about the shepherds shall be struck and the sheep will be scattered. Okay, and this was fulfilled when Jesus was taken. All of the disciples fled. All the disciples forsook him where God says, it shall come to pass in all the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 of it shall be cut off and die, but 1/3 shall be left in it. So what is this talking about? We're talking about the days of the Messiah. And he's talking about in all the land. He's talking about a totality here. He says 2/3 shall be cut off, and he says, but 1/3 shall be left in it. Anybody have any idea what he might be referencing there? There's two possibilities.
Most of them won't believe. Some of them will.
Okay, it could be talking about the church and the response of Israel to the gospel itself. And when he uses numbers like this or ratios like this, it is being used as a figure of speech. It's just talking about the majority of people are not going to believe Christ. The majority of people are not going to respond to the gospel. Okay, but 1/3, a lesser number, a remnant, if you will believe Christ, will obey the gospel. Okay, so there's one possibility. There is also another possibility that took place in the days of the Messiah, if you will. And what might that be? The destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, it could be referring to God's judgment on Jerusalem, which chapter 14 may very well be talking about, as we're going to see. And the idea that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and Israel will cease to be a nation at that point. So you've got these two possibilities, right? And in verse 9, God says, I will bring 1/3 through the fire. I will refine them as silver is refined, and I will test them as gold is tested. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. And I will say, this is my people, and each one will say, the Lord is my God. Okay? So let's say it was the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? And those who may have survived that. Just because they survived the destruction of Jerusalem, does this mean verse 9 would apply to them? Silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested, and they will call upon my name and answer them. Okay? Clearly, those people who obeyed the gospel in the first century there were individuals who were sorely tested and sorely tempted and persecuted, not only by the Jews, but also by Rome, in the second and even up to the third century. And God is testing them. He's refining them, okay? But then the result is, after they've been refined, the result will be God's purpose, or his desire will be fulfilled. Throughout the Old Testament, he's talked about his purpose. He talked about his desire. I will be your God, you shall be my people. And of course, Israel failed at that miserably. But with the coming of Christ, it has become a reality, because we are saved by our faith in him and not the keeping of a law which nobody can keep. Okay? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But because of Christ, God can say, this is my people. And each one will say, the Lord is my God. So it's a beautiful conclusion, really, of God's plan and his purpose here. Of course, that brings us now to chapter 14. And I'll tell you right out the gate that chapter 14 is probably one of the least understood chapters of the Bible. It certainly is in Zechariah. And again, there's two possible ways you can look at it primarily. Okay? So let's take a look at chapter 14 and see how Zechariah, or God through Zechariah, concludes his revelation here. The first thing that we need to be aware of is that in chapter 14, again, we have the repeated phrase, in that day. In fact, verse 1 starts off, behold, the day of the Lord is coming. And then he says, in that day, in verse 4. In verse 6 again, he says, in that day. In verse 8, in that day. In verse 9, in that day. In verse 13, in that day. In verse 20, in that day. And in verse 21, in that day. So all of the repetition of in that day throughout these three chapters are telling us that he's talking about all the same time period. Okay? And so here we come to chapter 14, and the first two verses. Let's go ahead and read those and see if we can get a handle on what maybe they're talking about. It says, behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Okay. So again, when he's talking about this Jerusalem, is he talking about physical Jerusalem? Or is he talking about spiritual Jerusalem? There's one part of this two verses. What? Okay, exactly. Okay. I was going to say there's one part that talks about something that says, man, that really sounds like physical Jerusalem, right? But then there's another part that makes it sound like it's talking about spiritual Jerusalem. And that is the last of verse 2, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city, right? Homer Haley looks at that and he says, this has got to be spiritual Jerusalem, okay? I don't necessarily agree with that. And some of that goes back to what Stuart's actually saying. I mean, he's talking about your houses are going to be rifled, right? Your women are going to be raped, Okay? They will divide the spoil in the midst of you. And how would this still be talking about in the days of the Messiah?
Because those aren't physical things that are going to happen necessarily, but Daniel talks about the war against the saints and post-Revelation saints.
Okay.
God's going to allow this war against the saints.
Okay. So are you leaning towards spiritual? Okay, you're leaning towards spiritual. However, the destruction of Jerusalem would also be taking place in the days of the Messiah. I mean, we're still in the days of the Messiah, in a sense. We are part of in that day, right? And so I think I kind of lean towards that. But was there a remnant that was saved as a result of the physical destruction of Jerusalem? There was? Okay, let's take a look at those passages, right? Take a look at those passages. Over in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22. Matthew 24 is a challenging chapter in the scriptures. A lot of people question whether it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem or whether it's talking about the final coming of Christ. Okay? Some people suggest that it's kind of a little both. Okay? I pretty much fall into the camp talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. The reason being is because Jesus says, when you see these things, flee to the mountains. Okay? If it's the second coming of Christ, that's not going to do you any good anyway. Okay? All right. So here we are in Matthew chapter 24, verses 15 through 22. Jesus says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those with nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. What would be the big deal if it was on the Sabbath? The gates of Jerusalem are locked up tight. Nobody could get in or get out, regardless of whether or not there was an army surrounding them or not. Okay. Of course, the issue with the winter, like you don't want to have to be fleeing to the mountains in the wintertime. Okay. So in verse 21, Jesus says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. So Jesus, of course, is warning people beforehand, as Stuart points out. And then this last verse, verse 22, he says, for the elect's sake, those days are shortened. He's talking about that judgment isn't going to consume everybody in Jerusalem. There will be those who will escape. There will be those who flee. Now, Josephus also talks about when Rome went in to destroy Jerusalem, that they killed everybody that they could kill. And then they reported to Caesar, okay, there's nobody left to kill. And Caesar said, all right, now raise the city, right? Destroy the temple. But that doesn't contradict the idea that still, you got people that got out of Dodge. There weren't anybody left in the city to kill, right? Because you had people that actually made their escape. So the idea that a remnant was still going to survive that or be saved could be very realistic if we're talking about the physical destruction of Israel. Also, since we're talking about, let's go to Luke 21, verses 20 through 24. Parallel account. In Luke chapter 21, beginning at verse 20, Jesus says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies then know that its desolation is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things that are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. There will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay? We're going to come back to that, the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled. Think about that as the times of the Gentiles being brought to an end. That means their ability to destroy my people. Okay? Because the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation clearly talk about God's vengeance on Rome. Okay, after they've destroyed his people. So,
Craig, I know
Yeah.
I know you're not there yet, but down in verse 5, as far as this being the destruction of Jerusalem, it gives reference to Amos, chapter 1.
mm-hmm,
The days of King Uzziah, and you will flee like you did back then.
mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, it talks about fleeing as they fled in the days of the great earthquake in Uzziah's day. And that's only mentioned in two places. Here in verse 5, and then Amos chapter 1 at verse 1. Amos talks about his prophecy being 2 years before the great earthquake. That would be in Uzziah's day. So apparently, there was a great earthquake that shook everybody and caused everybody to flee from Jerusalem at one point. All right. So, the day of the Lord is coming. Spoils will be divided in your midst. I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. This is explained by Rome. Right? How is Rome all the nations?
So they,
What?
they pretty much conquered all of them.
They're the world empire. Okay? They're the world empire, and also Rome's policy was they'll let your nation alone. Right? As long as you pay your taxes. As long as you pay your tribute to Caesar. They'll let you, govern yourself. They'll let you just take care of business. No problem at all. But they've got control. They've got control of economics. They've got control of the armies. They've got control of the monarchies. Okay? Why was Jerusalem destroyed? They tried to buck the system. Right? That's what happens when you step out of line with Rome. And that's the only reason they were destroyed. Okay? In fact, if I remember correctly, when Rome actually came to destroy Jerusalem, that's what they were coming for, to destroy the city, not kill everybody. But Israel, or the Jews, being stubborn as they were, boom, shut everybody tight. And of course, that left the Romans no choice.
Well, the Zealots had come in
Yeah.
to Jerusalem, and they were not only fighting the Romans, they were fighting the citizens that were already there too.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. It was a mess. Okay? All right. So, a remnant, whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, a remnant shall not be cut off from the city. Now, God will use Judah, he'll use Jerusalem, he'll use Israel to identify his spiritual people. Right? So when you come across these phrases, it's not always a physical location. All right, so that brings us then to the second section of chapter 14, which is verses 3 through 8. It says, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Then you shall flee through my mountain valley. From the mountain valley shall reach to Azal. Yes, you shall flee, as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with you. It shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light. The lights will diminish. It shall be one day which the Lord, or which is known to the Lord. neither day nor night. But at evening time it shall happen, that it shall be light. And in that day it shall be the living water shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur. So here you've got verse 8, that goes all the way back to chapter 13, verse 1. You have that fountain again being broken up. That fountain represents salvation that's going to come to Jerusalem. Now, we have some difficult passages here to understand in this section. I can't find any explanation of the idea of the Lord, his feet standing on the Mount of Olives and splitting in two. Okay? What do we know about the Mount of Olives?
You have your microphone network.
I probably didn't turn it on. Wait a second.
No, it was working a minute ago.
Yeah.
I think the battery went dead.
So, what's significant about the Mount of Olives? Is what? Well, you have it outside the city of Jerusalem, okay? It's to the east of Jerusalem. Is it known for anything? Olives. Yeah, quite possibly. Now, it's just shaped like a giant olive, right? Yeah, my first thought, oh, okay, he's talking about where Jesus was crucified. Was Jesus crucified on the Mount of Olives? No, he was crucified in the place of the stone, Golgotha. Okay? But what took place in the Mount of Olives, of course, is where he prayed. Okay? That's where he prayed, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Okay? That's where he was betrayed. That's where God answered his prayer, in that he gave him the strength to go through with the sacrifice that God wanted him to go through with. Some of the symbolism could be a reference to that. I don't know. Okay? But the idea of the Lord coming and standing on it and then splitting in two and creating this valley between it through which his people are going to be able to escape seems to indicate to me that it is significant and that it played a role in the salvation of mankind. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, where Jesus completely surrendered. Other than that, coming and fighting for his people. Okay? And quite physically, I guess you could say, that took place in Daniel and the book of Revelation, which talk about the destruction of the Roman Empire. Okay? So God, in those days of vengeance, destroyed the Roman Empire. Of course, Daniel, we know about that from the great prophecy that was given of the stone cut out without hands, that ground the image into powder and grew into a mighty mountain that could not be moved. No other kingdom would come after it. So, my question in verse 13 is, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. Is he just fighting against the Roman Empire, such as Daniel and Revelation might indicate? Or is he waging battle against the world? Is this just talking about physical Israel, or is this talking about spiritual Israel? Is this talking about the days of the Messiah?
That way up. When you look at Revelation, clearly, John is writing about those who stand against God and lose.
Mm-hmm.
Those who stand against Christ and lose. So there's a spiritual aspect to that. But, again, Revelation is also dealing with the nation of the conquering Rome.
Right.
Babylon, whatever.
Sure.
However you want to phrase that, but the Congress, the world empire. So in a biblical sense, he's also going to take them out.
Right.
So in a way, it's kind of good message that God is going to take out those who stand against his people.
There you go. I think that's it. I think that's the key. Whether it's physical or whether it's spiritual. What indication do we have that God is still waging battle or war against his enemies today? We can see it clearly in Daniel and Revelation about Rome.
And why you just take a look at Titanic, for example. Big old newspaper that says, God himself will not sink the ship.
Yeah.
And God used a little bit of ice to sink the ship. So, you know, it just, is that providence or is that, you know,
Mhm.
how? But, I mean, it's just, God is not going to stand on the sideline.
Yeah.
Let evil respond.
Yeah, exactly. You know, when we talk about the book of Revelation, what is the value of the book of Revelation for us today? What? Victory, right? It talks about victory and triumph of God and his people over physical empires, over the world, over these different things. You know, I call to mind Ephesians chapter 6. You know, we're engaged in a spiritual warfare, right? We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the heavenly places, right? You know, our adversary, who's our adversary? The devil. The devil's a spiritual being, you know, and we're engaged in that warfare. And Jesus, is he still engaged in that warfare? Yeah, he makes intercession for us. He's our advocate. When Stephen was being stoned, what did he see? Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Not sitting, standing, right? What did Luke say in the first few verses of Acts? The former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach. He continues to do and teach, okay? Even to this day. And he does so through us, and he does so certainly through the Holy Spirit. And then, you know, Stuart mentioned the idea of providence the other day. Providence, God providing for. You know, certainly God will provide for his glory. And he will certainly provide for us as well. So we've got, you know, we've got this picture of the Lord engaging in this battle. And I think as we look at it in the context of these 3 chapters of Zechariah, that he's talking about in the days of the Messiah, I'm going to continue fighting. I'm going to fight for my people. I'm going to defend my people. I'm going to save my people. Okay? And so the idea is that as you fled from the earthquake, verse 5 here, as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, thus the Lord my God will come and all the saints with you. Now, why is he referencing God coming with the earthquake? Take a look at Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12, which itself is a quote from Haggai. The writer of Hebrews is encouraging these discouraged Jewish Christians to hold on to their Christianity, to hear what God has to say, to listen to him. And he says in verse 27, now this yet once more indicates the removal. Let's start in verse 26. Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. It comes from Haggai chapter 2 at verse 6, where God says he's going to set Zerubbabel as a signet, and that he is going to shake the heavens and the earth once more. And of course, Haggai is after the return from captivity, and God there is talking about his future kingdom. And so the idea, God's going to come in battle, right? He is going to shake things up just like in the earthquake in Uzziah's day, right? People are going to flee from that. And the things that he's shaking up all those world empires. He's shaking up all those systems of religion. So he can establish that which cannot and will not be moved, right? So it's kind of an interesting picture there that he gives. Also, I want you to take a look at verse 7. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord. That call anything to mind? He's talking about when Christ comes or when the Lord comes to battle, it will be one day that is known to the Lord. What?
This fire person says there'll be a unique day.
Okay.
So, I mean, no one knows when it's going.
That's right. Nobody knows when it's going to happen. Take a look at Matthew 24 again, verse 36. Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And what does Jesus say in verse 36? But of that day and hour, no one knows, no, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. This chapter had begun with the disciples asking him, when is all this going to happen? When's the destruction of this temple going to happen? When is it going to be that one stone is not left upon another? And Jesus begins to tell them about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And in verse 36, he says, nobody knows that day, only my Father in heaven. And so this may very much be a reference to that here in Zechariah 14, verse 7. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord. Okay. So the idea that this is just that day. Right? Again, this ties it to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, let's go back up to the Mount of Olives type thing. This whole idea that he is going to come and his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. There is nothing that indicates that we should take that literally, right? Everything is to be taken literally unless the context demands otherwise. The whole context of these last three chapters are apocalyptic. They indicate that these things shouldn't be taken literally. But let's take a look at what Jesus says back in Luke 21. In Luke 21, verses 25 through 28. This language is going to sound very much like Zechariah 14, when it says, and there shall be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, when these things begin to happen, look up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. All right. They will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and with great glory. Matthew's account says the same thing when we look at verses 29 through 31. In Matthew 24. There, Jesus says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send with his angels, he will send his angels with the great sound of a trumpet. And they will gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. A couple of things about these two passages. Okay, what does it mean they will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds? Does that mean literally that people are going to look up and they're going to see Jesus riding a cloud like a chariot, coming in judgment against Jerusalem? Or is it a figure of speech? Is it a figure of apocalyptic speech? Throughout the scriptures, God would come with the clouds in judgment. God will come with clouds. God will come with clouds. It doesn't mean a physical representation. They will see the sign of the Son of Man coming with the clouds. It is just a picture of judgment. Just like in Acts chapter 2, where Peter is quoting Joel, and these two passages here, darkness, the stars, the heavens will be shaken. They will not give their light. Okay? The sun shall be turned to darkness. Do those things literally happen? Or are they poetic language indicating the end of either a nation or, in this case, Jerusalem?
I don't argue that there's a lot of figures of speech happening, but how do you reconcile that with Acts 1, where Jesus was taken up and a cloud took him out of their sight, and then the say, he'll come the same way that he came away from him.
Uh-huh.
That seems to say he's coming in on a cloud like away.
Yeah. Now, the question that I would have to ask there is that angel talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or is he talking about the second coming? See, a lot of people in chapter 24 of Matthew and chapter 21 of Luke, because they have that picture of Jesus coming with a cloud, they say, oh, this is talking about the second coming. But that language is often used when it talks about coming in judgment, right, against a nation. Given the context of Zechariah 12 through 14, it would seem to me that this is talking about the judgment that's going to come against Jerusalem that Jesus talked about in chapter 24 and chapter 21, okay? Would I stake my life to that? Nope, right? Because, I mean, but this is just the best explanation that I can figure out anyway. Steve and then Tommy.
In Luke 21, verse 32, says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place."
Right.
So that talks about the second coming, the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, clearly it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem when he says that. Tommy?
Here's what I think.
Okay.
Whenever the scriptures mention the Son of Man, I always think Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
chapter 7. And you read the vision that Daniel was given in chapter 7, verse 13. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, it was the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of those references to the coming of the Son of Man, if not all, is from a perspective of God looking down and the Son of Man coming to him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was given a place that's described as the sitting at his right hand, and he was given a kingdom. And that all happened in the days of the Messiah,
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning.
Right.
And when we try to fit that into the end of time, it doesn't work.
Uh-uh.
But it does work if you take the perspective of not coming to earth, but coming to heaven.
Right. Yeah. In fact, I think that when in chapter 1 of Acts, as Austin mentioned, the idea is Jesus or cloud received him out of their sight. I think that's the earthly perspective of what Daniel is writing about in the 7th chapter. They're seeing him go up to heaven. Daniel is seeing him come up to heaven, right? And when he sits, when he ascends, that's when he's given power and dominion over everything. Remember what Jesus said at the end of Matthew? All authority has been given to me in heaven and earth, right?
That's when everything starts. That's when
Yeah.
people are gathered from east, west, and they come together to be part of a kingdom that he has just been
Mm-hmm.
anointed as the king of.
Yeah,
A new day.
yeah, that's right. And so it all fits together pretty well.
It makes sense. Then back in Luke 21, it says, "And the power of heaven will be shaken, and then they see the Son of Man coming into the cloud." So it's referring to those that will be shaken.
Oh, very good. Very good. Very good. Steve is saying, what verse is that, Steve? In Luke 21? Let me get over here in Luke. Take a look at Luke 21, 26, and 27. says in verse 26, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So Stephen's suggesting that the idea that it's the powers in heaven that are going to see the Son of Man come with great glory. I'm not absolutely sure about that, okay, because it starts off talking about men's hearts failing them, right, from fear. We'd have to actually do kind of a word study on that that's beyond the scope of this class right now. But have you got your translation there, Milt? Oh, you haven't got it? Okay. All right. So that's something to consider and to look into as well. The idea here is that you have to remember, when you're looking at this apocalyptic language, it is an error to try to read something into every single line and every single verse, because it's poetry. It's just like the Proverbs. If you try to read something into every little detail, you're going to miss the point. Okay? A proverb teaches one primary point. Are there other things you can get out of it? Sure. But don't miss that one point. And you're making a mistake if you try to read it off like every little detail of that proverb has something to say, because it doesn't necessarily do that. All right. And then, of course, verse 8 is talking about kind of a consummation of these things. In that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, half of them toward the western sea. It's like it's going to go east to west. In both summer and winter it shall occur. What does that mean? This fountain's going to be opened up. It's going to flow both directions. We often talk about the blood of Christ going both directions, don't we? Covering those who are saved in the Old Testament, as well as those who would be saved 2,000 years later. I don't know. That might just be a quinky-dink, right? But then what does it mean in both summer and winter it shall occur? Anybody have any idea? What are you saying? No end, right? Sometimes you'll have a stream, and what will happen in the summer? It'll dry up, right? Or if you're in the Southwest, it'll dry up in the winter sometimes. But the idea is this stream will never dry up. It will take place. It will continue to pour out in both the summer and the winter. If you want to jot them down, your notes, references to this stream can be found in John 4, the one with the well, verses 10 through 14. And then John 7, verses 37 through 38, where Jesus cries out that he will give the waters of life.
Craig, the thing I read said if he's referencing literal sea, it's the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm. Sea to sea, right? And yeah, I've read those same things. And then verse 9, some people will end this section of verse 9, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be the Lord is one and his name one. 1 Corinthians 15:25 talks about he will reign until all things are put under his feet. And then Ephesians 1:20 through 23, God made him head over all things and above all principalities and powers. That's in Ephesians 1:20 through 23. From Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be raised up and inhabited in her place. What's that a picture of? All the land turned into a plain. All of it leveled. But Jerusalem, which represents God's people, shall be raised up. There's that mighty mountain that Daniel talks about. Okay? So it's talking about the continued victory of God's purpose and his plan. Verse 11, the people shall dwell in it, and no longer shall there be utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. We see a beautiful picture of that in chapters 21 and 22 of the book of Revelation. But then verses 12 through 15 sound like they're right out of a Steven Spielberg movie. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem, those who oppose God and his people. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets. Their tongues shall dissolve in their mouths. And it shall come to pass in that day that a great panic from the Lord will be among them. Everyone will seize the hand of his neighbor and raise his hand against his neighbor's hand. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold, silver, and apparel in great abundance. Such also shall be the plague on the horse, on the mule, on the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in the camps. So shall this plague be. Again, we wouldn't take this literally, but it is a picture of the utter destruction of the enemies of God and the rewards or the victory going to his people. Talking about all the treasures being gathered up for them. Revelation 16 talks about all the bowls of wrath being poured out on the enemies of God and his people. That might be a parallel to this passage. Then in verses 16 through 19, and it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. What is this Feast of Tabernacles? Okay. First off, he's talking about the remnants of all the nations. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the Gentiles that would obey the gospel. He's talking about those who will come to the church and come to the kingdom to worship the Lord, to honor the King, and keep the Feast of Tabernacles. What was the Feast of Tabernacles for? To remember that there were wanderers in the wilderness. Okay? And this is a feast of great joy and great thanksgiving. So the people that will come to the church, the people that will come to God, they'll come and they'll worship with joy and thanksgiving. And they shall be delivered from the wilderness. A lot of times that wilderness represents sin, just like Egypt does here. Right? So those people come up out of sin. And then finally, in verses 20 through 21, in that day, holiness to the Lord shall be engraved on the bells of the horses. The pots in the Lord's house shall be like bowls before the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. In that day there shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. I believe what this is talking about is within God's church, all will be clean in the Lord's kingdom. This is what God told Peter in Acts chapter 10 with the vision and the going into Cornelius. And Revelation 21:27 talks about nothing will enter in that will undefile. He says, there shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. Canaanites were unclean. Horses, the bells, horses were unclean. Right? The bowls, all the pots, all the pans throughout Israel. Teaching the book of Malachi.
Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Thank you for coming out for a period of Bible study. Let's remember that we come together again Sunday morning, 9 a.m. for worship and then Bible study. Christy's not with us tonight. Evidently, she's had some dental work done today. She's home. Denny and Diane are not here. Diane has had a respiratory problem. She's having some coughing problems, so she's at home. Keep those in our prayer. Remember Austin and Sarah going down to Texas on the 3rd. Sarah's got a medical appointment on the 4th. And also remember, too, that she's going up to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester during the week of the 9th for 10 days. Craig and Charlie are going to be gone starting Tuesday. They're leaving, going to Arizona and California. And they'll be coming back on the 17th. Also remember, too, that this Sunday at 5 p.m., Craig and Shirley are hosting a evangelistic focus group. And it's going to be every Sunday, or every first Sunday of the month. It'll be at their home. So if you're if you're interested in evangelism, please join that group. There's going to be a gospel meeting at the Springdale Westside Church. It'll be March 15th through the 18th, which is going to be a Sunday through Wednesday. J.R. Bronger from Kansas City is going to be presenting lessons. I'm not familiar with him, but that'll be coming up the second and third week of March. And that's going to be, there is one thing, I'm going to post this, but they're going to have the afternoon worship at 2 p.m. on that first Sunday. So that might be something that we can attend. We're finishing up February. When we come together Sunday, that'll be the first day of March. Remember that the new duty rosters are in effect. There's going to be new rotation of classes. There's going to be new rotation of teachers. If you're in the adult classes, remember that we are starting into the book of Philippians. There's a lime green covered workbook back here. If you need one of those, be sure to get it. Is there anything else we need to mention tonight before we're closed? Okay, we'll be closed in prayer.
Will you pray with me, please? Dear Lord, we thank you for this day that you've blessed us with and the opportunity that you've provided for us to come together to study your word and to sing a song to praise your name. We thank you, dear Lord, for all of the many things that you've blessed us with in our lives, for our families and our homes and this congregation, that we can support and encourage one another as we go through life and do our best to follow your will and to put you first in our lives. We ask, dear Lord, that you would be with all of those who are struggling with their health, and that if it is your will, that they'll have that restored back to them. In matters such as those and all others, we know that you know best, and even if the outcome is not what we want, that it is best. Once again, we thank you for everything that you've given us, but especially the gift of your Son, for it's through him that we have the opportunity to one day spend eternity with you. And we thank you so much for that, for without it, we'd be hopelessly lost. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen.